My name is Louise, and I am 67 years old. For 35 years, I dedicated my life as a CPS investigator to protecting vulnerable children, learning to discern truth from lies in the most complex family situations. I single-handedly raised my daughter Sarah after her father left, pouring every ounce of love and stability into creating the home she deserved. When my grandchildren Ethan and Chloe came along, I became their devoted grandmother, always believing in the inherent goodness of family bonds and the power of unconditional love. Then came the betrayal that shattered everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. After my knee surgery left me temporarily vulnerable, my son-in-law Greg launched a vicious public campaign against me. He spread lies that I was emotionally abusive and neglectful towards Sarah, even implying darker accusations. Sarah, tragically manipulated by his poison, sent me a letter that cut through my heart like a blade. You have no humanity left. Cut all ties. When I tried to hug my grandson, Ethan, he screamed, "Mom says you hurt her. You're crazy." My entire life's work protecting children was maliciously twisted against me, branding me as the very thing I'd fought against my whole career. Yet as despair threatened to consume me, something deeper stirred within my investigator's soul. What Greg and Sarah didn't know was that I still possessed something powerful, decades of meticulous case notes documenting Sarah's actual childhood old family videos that would expose their lies, and most importantly, the secret sacrifices I'd made that would soon come to light. This time, their cruel slander wouldn't just unravel, it would reveal the shocking truth about who really needed protecting. The morning after receiving Sarah's devastating letter, I drove to her house with trembling hands gripping the steering wheel. My heart pounded as I approached the familiar front door where I'd once been welcomed with warm hugs and excited grandchildren rushing to greet me. But when I turned the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. They had changed the locks. As I stood there bewildered, still processing this cruel symbol of my banishment, Greg's voice cut through the morning air behind me. "What are you doing here, Louise?" His tone was cold, calculated, nothing like the respectful son-in-law who once called me Mom. I turned to face him, seeing a stranger wearing Greg's face. "I need to talk to Sarah. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. I would never hurt." "Stop right there," he interrupted, his voice carrying an unsettling calm that made my blood run cold. "You're a meddling, manipulative old woman, Louise. You undermine my parenting every chance you get. The children are confused and upset because of your constant interference. You're incompetent as a grandmother, and frankly, you're a liability to their emotional well-being. We're cutting you out for good." The words hit me like physical blows. This man who had eaten at my table for 8 years, who I'd helped through job losses and celebrated with during promotions, was systematically dismantling my character with the precision of a surgeon. I could see it now. This wasn't about protecting the children. This was about absolute control. Greg needed to be the sole authority figure, the perfect father in his carefully constructed family image, and my presence threatened that narrative. "Greg, please," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "You know me. You know how much I love Ethan and Chloe. Remember when Ethan took his first steps toward me? Remember how Chloe would only calm down when I sang her that lullaby? I was there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every moment they needed comfort. How can you erase all of that?" For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, but it vanished quickly. "Those days are over, Louise. You need to accept that and move on." That's when I heard footsteps behind Greg, and my heart lifted with desperate hope. It was my son Mark, surely coming to mediate this horrible situation. But as he approached, I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop, the same cold detachment I just witnessed in Greg. "Mom," Mark said, his voice eerily similar to his brother-in-law's measured tone. "Brenda's right about this. You're too interfering, too controlling. We need to do what's best for the kids, and that means you staying away. It's time you understood boundaries." Brenda, Greg's sister, had been poisoning my own son against me. The realization hit me like an avalanche of betrayal. My own child, the boy I'd raised alone, was choosing his in-laws over his mother. But the worst was yet to come. As we stood there in this surreal confrontation, Ethan appeared in the doorway. My heart leaped at the sight of my precious grandson, but instead of running to me as he always had, he stayed frozen in place. Greg knelt down and whispered something in his ear, then gently pushed him forward. Ethan walked toward me slowly, his young face twisted with confusion and what looked like coached anger. When I reached out to embrace him, he jerked away violently. "Don't touch me, you bad grandma." He screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mom says you hurt her. You're crazy, just like the mean people on TV." The words were clearly not his own, but hearing them from his innocent mouth shattered something fundamental inside me. This child who used to race into my arms was now recoiling from me in fear and disgust. Later that evening, as I sat alone in my empty house trying to process what had happened, my phone buzzed with notifications from Facebook. Someone had tagged me in a post on our local community page. With trembling fingers, I opened the link and felt my world crumble further. The post, written by an anonymous account, read, "Beware of certain respected elders in our community who hide dark secrets of child abuse behind their professional reputations. Their past is finally catching up to them, and they're losing their minds trying to maintain control. Protect your children from wolves in sheep's clothing." The comments below were already filling with speculation and gossip from neighbors I'd known for decades. People were connecting dots that didn't exist, remembering my CPS career and wondering if I'd been covering up my own crimes all these years. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from Anderson & Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of. With shaking hands, I opened it to find a formal notice that felt like a death sentence. On behalf of our clients, Greg and Sarah Martinez, we hereby notify you of the immediate termination of all grandparent visitation rights concerning minors, Ethan Martinez and Chloe Martinez. Any attempt to contact said minors directly or indirectly will be considered harassment and grounds for a restraining order. This decision is final and non-negotiable. As I read those words, I felt something die inside me. In the span of 1 week, I had gone from beloved grandmother to legal stranger. They had transformed my love into a crime, my presence into a threat. The children I had helped raise the grandchildren, who were the light of my life, were now legally protected from me as if I were a dangerous predator. That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my mind reeling with devastation, shock, and a heartbreak so profound it felt like drowning. But somewhere in the darkness, something else began to stir, a cold, familiar fury that I recognized from my decades of fighting for justice. They had no idea what they had awakened. The isolation grew more poisonous with each passing day. Greg and Sarah weren't content with simply cutting me out. They were systematically destroying my reputation in every corner of our community. At our church, where I'd been a faithful member for 15 years, I began noticing whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The pastor, Father Martinez, pulled me aside after Sunday service with a concerned expression. "Louise, there have been some concerns raised about your relationship with your family. Perhaps it would be best if you took some time away from volunteer activities until things settle down." The children's school was next. I discovered this when I tried to attend Chloe's school play. something I'd never missed in 3 years. The security guard, someone who had always greeted me warmly, approached with obvious discomfort. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're not on the approved visitor list. I can't let you in." Brenda had been busy. Through her network of social media accounts and community connections, she was spreading carefully crafted insinuations. Her posts never mentioned my name directly, but anyone who knew our family could connect the dots. Praying for families dealing with toxic elders who refuse to respect boundaries, she would write, followed by, "Sometimes the people we trust with our children have hidden darkness we never see." The phone calls stopped. The texts went unanswered. When I tried calling the house, Sarah would pick up and immediately hang up upon hearing my voice. When I called Ethan and Chloe's cell phones gifts I had given them for their birthdays, the numbers had been disconnected, but it was what I overheard that truly broke my heart and opened my eyes to the devastating truth. I had gone to the grocery store at an unusual time, hoping to avoid the neighbors who now looked at me with suspicion. As I rounded the cereal aisle, I heard familiar voices from the next row over. Sarah and Brenda were shopping together, their conversation floating over the shelves. "It's so exhausting dealing with Mom," Sarah was saying, her voice heavy with what sounded like practiced weariness. "She just can't let go of the past. It's like she wants to control every aspect of our lives, just like she did when I was growing up." My hands froze on the shopping cart handle. What past was she talking about? Brenda's voice was soothing, supportive. "You did the right thing, honey. Children need to see that adults can set boundaries with toxic people, even family members. Greg is such a good father. He won't let anyone harm his children's emotional well-being." "I know," Sarah replied, and I could hear tears in her voice. "It's just hard because part of me still remembers the good times. But Dr. Peterson helped me understand that those memories might not be as real as I thought. Sometimes we create false happy memories to cope with trauma." Dr. Peterson, a therapist I'd never heard of, helping my daughter understand that her childhood memories were false. My blood ran cold as the pieces began clicking together. "The important thing," Brenda continued, "is that you're protecting Ethan and Chloe from the same pattern. They don't need to grow up walking on eggshells around a controlling grandmother the way you did." I stood there in that grocery aisle, gripping my cart to keep from collapsing as the horrible truth washed over me. Sarah wasn't just being manipulated, she was actively choosing to rewrite our history together. She was allowing, even encouraging, the transformation of every loving memory we shared into something dark and twisted. That night, alone in my kitchen, I forced myself to confront the most painful secret I'd been carrying for over 20 years. The one sacrifice I'd made that now seemed like the cruelest irony of all. Sarah had been 17 when it happened. She was going through a rebellious phase, dating a boy I knew was trouble. One night, she came home 3 hours past curfew, and I could smell alcohol on her breath. But it was worse than teenage drinking. In her purse, which she'd carelessly left open, I found a small bag of pills, ecstasy, according to the boy she'd been with, who was already known to the police. What Sarah didn't know was that earlier that evening, there had been a drug raid at the party she'd attended. Several teenagers were arrested, and if her name had been on the list, her future would have been destroyed. College applications were due in 2 months. Her dreams of becoming a teacher would have evaporated. I spent the next 72 hours calling in every favor I'd accumulated in 15 years of CPS work. I spoke to judges, prosecutors, and police officers I'd worked with on cases. I provided character references and convinced people to overlook certain evidence. Most importantly, I spent my entire savings, nearly $50,000, on legal fees and what amounted to quiet settlements to keep Sarah's name out of the official record. She never knew. I let her believe she'd simply been lucky, that her name had never come up in the investigation. I wanted her to move forward without the weight of what could have happened, without the shame that might have crushed her spirit. Now, 25 years later, as I sat in my empty house being accused of emotional abuse and toxicity, the irony was almost unbearable. The same daughter I'd bankrupted myself to protect was using my love as evidence of my cruelty. When I could no longer bear the isolation, I decided to reach out through our mutual friend Mary Patterson, who had known our family for decades. I asked Mary to simply tell Sarah that I had always loved her and had made sacrifices she didn't know about. I hoped that maybe if she understood the depth of my devotion, she might soften her heart. The response came through Mark, delivered with a coldness that still makes me shiver. "Mom, you're always trying to make us feel guilty with your so-called sacrifices. Your past choices are your own business. Greg says you're trying to manipulate us with guilt trips, and honestly, I think he's right. You need to stop living in the past and let us move on." When I tried to explain just a little about the financial sacrifices I'd made for Sarah's future, the response was even more crushing. Sarah called me directly for the first time in weeks, but only to deliver a message that felt like a dagger to my heart. "Mom, please stop trying to make yourself sound like some kind of saint. It makes Greg sound like a terrible person when you talk about your sacrifices, and it's destroying my peace of mind. Whatever you did in the past, I never asked for it. I just want you to leave us alone." The final blow came when I encountered Ethan at the park, where I used to take him to feed the ducks. He was with Greg, and when he saw me, he didn't run away this time. Instead, he walked up to me with eyes that looked far too old for his 9-year-old face. "Grandma," he said in a voice devoid of the warmth that used to make my heart sing. "Mom says you're bad for our family. She says you make her sad and scared. Why can't you just leave us alone, like she asked?" I knelt down to his level, fighting back tears. "Ethan, sweetheart, I love you and your mom more than anything in the world. Sometimes grown-ups have misunderstandings." "No," he interrupted, stepping back. "Mom says that's what bad people say. People. She says they always try to make you feel sorry for them." He turned and walked back to Greg, who was watching with what looked like satisfaction. 3 days later, another letter arrived from Anderson and Associates. This one was even more devastating than the first. If I signed a binding agreement permanently relinquishing all grandparent rights and submitted to a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, they would generously allow me to send supervised pre-approved letters to the grandchildren twice a year. The message was clear: admit you're mentally unstable, surrender all legal rights to your grandchildren, and maybe we'll let you send them a Christmas card that we'll read first to make sure it's not too toxic. As I read those words, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The pain was still there, the heartbreak that threatened to destroy me, but underneath it, something cold and determined was taking shape. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. They had no idea that their campaign of cruelty was about to face the methodical, relentless investigation skills of a woman who had spent 35 years uncovering the truth in the most complex family situations. The real battle was about to begin. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other day in my new isolated existence. I was drinking my coffee and trying to summon the strength to face another day of silence when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a uniformed process server holding an official-looking envelope. My hand shook as I signed for the delivery and tore open the seal. The letterhead read, "Superior Court of California," and the words that followed felt like a death sentence. "Temporary restraining order. Louise Margaret Chen is hereby prohibited from coming within 500 feet of the following individuals: Sarah Martinez, Gregory Martinez, Ethan Martinez and Chloe Martinez. Respondent is further prohibited from contacting said individuals directly or indirectly through any means, including but not limited to telephone, email, text message, social media, or third parties. Violation of this order constitutes a criminal offense punishable by fine and/or imprisonment. They had done it. In the eyes of the law, I was now officially a threat to my own family. My love had been criminalized, my presence legally defined as dangerous. If I so much as approached Ethan's school or accidentally encountered them at the grocery store, I could be arrested, but I wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. In a moment of desperate determination, I decided to make one final gesture of love. I spent 3 days creating something that represented everything beautiful about our relationship before it was poisoned. I gathered every photo I had of Ethan and Chloe from their births to last Christmas, arranging them chronologically in a handmade album. Each page told a story: first steps, birthday parties, bedtime stories, trips to the zoo, ice cream dates, and lazy afternoons in my backyard garden. With each photo, I wrote a small note in my careful handwriting. Ethan's first word was Gamma Grandma. He was trying to say my name. Chloe insisted on wearing her princess dress to the grocery store because she wanted to be beautiful like Grandma. The day we built the snowman that looked like a lopsided penguin, and we laughed until our stomachs hurt. On the final page, I wrote a letter that came from the deepest part of my heart. My precious grandchildren, if you ever read this, when you're older, please know that loving you was the greatest joy of my life. Every moment we shared was a treasure I will carry in my heart forever. Whatever you've been told about me, please remember that my love for you was real, pure, and unconditional. You brought light to my world in ways you may never understand. I pray that someday, when you're old enough to seek the truth for yourselves, you'll remember the grandmother who loved you beyond measure. Until then, I will hold you in my heart and in my prayers every single day. I drove to Mark's house, neutral territory, since the restraining order specifically named Greg and Sarah's family, and left the album by his front door with a note asking him to please give it to the children when he felt it was appropriate. 3 days later, I was mindlessly scrolling through Facebook when I saw a post that stopped my heart. It was from Brenda's account, and the image made me physically sick. There was my handmade album, torn to pieces, scattered across what looked like a garbage can. The photos I'd lovingly selected were ripped in half, my carefully written notes reduced to illegible fragments. The caption read, "Spring cleaning time, getting rid of old clutter and toxic memories. Some people just can't accept that their time is over. Time to move forward from all the negativity. Jack your boundaries are healthy, protecting our peace." The comments below were even worse. Neighbors and acquaintances I'd known for years were liking the post, adding their own supportive comments. Good for you. Sometimes you have to cut out the poison to let the good grow. Family doesn't mean you have to tolerate abuse. I stared at that image until my eyes burned with tears I couldn't shed. Those weren't just photographs, they were irreplaceable moments, the visual documentation of the purest love I'd ever known. And they had been destroyed, not just carelessly, but mockingly publicly, as a statement of just how completely I'd been erased from their lives. That's when I realized Mark had been there when it happened. My own son had watched them destroy those precious memories and had allowed Brenda to post about it online. The boy I'd raised alone, who I'd supported through every challenge and celebrated through every triumph, had actively participated in the desecration of my love for his children. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that something inside me simply broke. Not the way it had been breaking gradually over the past months, but cleanly permanently, like a bone that snaps under too much pressure. 2 days later, Greg sent me a text message that was clearly designed to be the final word. Consider this chapter closed, Louise. Don't contact us again. Ever. You're causing too much trouble for our family, and it needs to stop. Move on with your life, and let us live ours in peace. That same afternoon, Brenda called our mutual friend Janet Morrison, knowing full well that Janet would repeat every word to me. According to Janet, Brenda had described me as completely unhinged and obsessed with controlling people she has no right to control. She told Janet that I was stalking the family and that they were considering getting a permanent restraining order because I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. By evening, my phone was ringing with concerned calls from church members and neighbors who had heard through the gossip network that I was having a mental breakdown and harassing my family. The story being spread was that I was a bitter, deranged old woman who couldn't accept that my family had rightfully moved on without me. That night, sitting in my therapist's office during an emergency session I'd scheduled because I was afraid of what I might do to myself, I finally revealed the secret that had been eating at my soul for decades. There's something else, I told Dr. Williams, my voice barely above a whisper. Something I've never told anyone, not even Sarah. I told her about the night I found Sarah then, 8 years old, huddled in her closet after witnessing her father's drunken rage, the night he'd thrown a lamp across the room and screamed that she was nothing but trouble before storming out forever. I told her about the weeks of nightmares that followed, about how Sarah would wake up screaming that she was bad, that she had made Daddy leave. As a CPS investigator, I knew the signs of psychological trauma. I could see that Sarah was beginning to develop a distorted sense of reality, blaming herself for her father's abandonment and rewriting events to make sense of her pain. So I made a choice that seemed loving at the time, but now felt like the cruelest mistake of my life. I systematically helped Sarah forget the worst parts of her childhood. When she would remember her father's angry words, I would gently redirect her to happier memories. When she would blame herself for the divorce, I would tell her stories about what a good girl she was and how much I loved her. I even had her see a child psychologist who specialized in helping children process traumatic memories in healthy ways, which meant helping her suppress the painful ones. It worked. Sarah grew up believing she'd had a loving, stable childhood with a devoted mother who had protected her from all harm. She didn't remember the poverty we'd endured after her father left, or the nights I'd worked double shifts to keep us afloat, or the sacrifices I'd made to ensure she never felt abandoned again. But in suppressing those difficult memories, I had also robbed her of the ability to fully understand the depth of my love and sacrifice. Worse, I had left her vulnerable to someone like Greg, who could exploit her fragmented memories and convince her that her sense of something being wrong meant that I had been the problem all along. "Don't you see?" I whispered to Dr. Williams through my tears. "I created the very thing that's destroying me now. I taught her to rewrite history, to protect herself from pain, and now she's rewriting our entire relationship to protect herself from me. My love became her trauma, and my sacrifices became her prison. The irony was so profound, it felt like cosmic punishment. I had spent my career protecting children from parents who would harm them, and now I was being accused of being exactly that kind of parent. I had sacrificed everything to give Sarah a perfect childhood, and she was using that perfection as evidence of my deception. As I sat in that office, feeling the weight of 35 years of secrets and sacrifices crushing down on me. I realized that my identity as a mother, a grandmother, a protector of children had been completely obliterated. Everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about the power of devotion had been turned into weapons against me. But in that moment of complete devastation, I also felt something else stirring, something cold and focused and utterly without mercy. They had awakened something in me that they were not prepared to face. The methodical, relentless investigator who had spent decades uncovering the truth in impossible situations was about to turn those skills on the people who had tried to erase her. The real story was just beginning. The revelation about Sarah's suppressed childhood trauma created a psychological prison I couldn't escape. Night after night, I lay awake in my empty house, tormented by the weight of that monumental secret. Had I done the right thing by helping her forget her father's cruelty? Or had I unknowingly created the very vulnerability that Greg was now exploiting? The questions consumed me like acid. Every memory became suspect. Every choice I'd made as a mother suddenly seemed twisted and wrong. I found myself questioning not just my parenting, but my entire career as a CPS investigator. If I couldn't recognize the signs of manipulation in my own family, how many cases had I mishandled? How many children had I failed to protect? The isolation was suffocating. Days would pass without hearing another human voice, except for automated phone messages and grocery store clerks. I stopped answering my phone because every call seemed to bring more devastating news about how thoroughly I was being erased from every corner of my former life. Then Greg and Brenda escalated their campaign to a level I hadn't thought possible. I first learned about it from Dr. Patricia Holmes, a former colleague from the Children's Protection Association. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight with concern and barely contained outrage. "Louise, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be difficult to hear. There are rumors circulating through our professional networks about you. Someone has been suggesting that you're experiencing cognitive decline, that you're having unstable fantasies about your past cases." My blood ran cold. "What kind of rumors?" "They're saying you've been making wild accusations against family members, that you're unable to distinguish between your professional cases and your personal life. Brenda Martinez has been calling child psychology associations, implying that your recent behavior suggests you may have been unreliable in your casework." The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. They weren't just attacking my character. They were systematically dismantling my professional legacy. 40 years of impeccable service, hundreds of children protected, countless families, helped, all of it being twisted into evidence of my incompetence. Within weeks, the consequences began cascading. The State Child Welfare Alumni Association quietly removed me from their advisory board. A conference where I was scheduled to speak on parental alienation suddenly found my presentation no longer appropriate for their audience. Professional contacts who had respected me for decades began avoiding my calls, clearly having heard whispers about my supposed mental instability. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. The legal fees from fighting the restraining order had already drained my savings, but Greg wasn't finished with his financial warfare. His lawyer filed additional motions, each requiring expensive responses from my attorney. Then came the phone call that shattered what remained of my security. "Mrs. Chen, this is Margaret Foster from Wells Fargo. We've received reports of suspicious activity on your accounts. There are concerns about your mental competency to manage your finances. We're required to freeze your assets pending a medical evaluation." Brenda had been busy. She'd contacted my bank, my pension administrators, even my insurance company, painting a picture of a confused, deteriorating old woman who might be vulnerable to financial exploitation or might be engaging in erratic spending. The irony was devastating. They were financially abusing me while claiming to protect me from financial abuse. Within a month, I was evicted from my home of 23 years. The house where I'd raised Sarah, where I'd hosted birthday parties for my grandchildren, where every room held memories of the family that had now disowned me, all of it was gone. I'll never forget the humiliation of that final day. My belongings, the accumulation of a lifetime, were sold at a public auction to cover my debts. I watched strangers rifle through photo albums, laugh at my old-fashioned furniture, and bid on the china set I'd been saving to pass down to Sarah. The homeless shelter was a special kind of hell for someone who had spent her career in the system. I knew how these places worked, knew the staff protocols, and the unspoken rules. But knowing didn't make the reality any less crushing. Sleeping in a room with 30 other women, many struggling with mental illness or addiction, having my few remaining possessions locked in a small metal locker, standing in line for meals served on plastic trays. The worst part wasn't the loss of privacy or comfort. It was the complete erasure of my identity. I had gone from respected professional to anonymous vagrant. No one at the shelter knew who I had been or what I had accomplished. I was just another elderly woman who had somehow lost everything. That's when Greg and Sarah delivered their most devastating blow yet. I learned about it from another shelter resident who recognized me from a news broadcast. The Family Harmony Foundation, a local children's charity that supported youth sports programs, was holding their annual fundraising gala. The featured speakers were Sarah and Greg Martinez, advocates for healthy family dynamics and child protection. I managed to watch the event on the shelter's communal television, hiding in the back corner while other residents dozed or watched their own programs. What I saw on that screen nearly stopped my heart. There was Ethan, my precious grandson, standing at a podium that had been lowered to accommodate his small stature. He was wearing his best suit, his hair neatly combed, looking like the perfect picture of a confident, well-adjusted child. "My parents taught me about courage," he said in his clear young voice. Sometimes brave parents have to make hard decisions to protect their children from difficult people who don't understand boundaries. My mom and dad show me every day what it means to put family first and keep us safe from people who might hurt us with their problems. The applause was thunderous. I watched in horror as my 10-year-old grandson delivered what was clearly a carefully rehearsed speech that painted me as the threat he needed protection from. The innocence in his voice made it even more heartbreaking he truly believed what he was saying. Then came Chloe's contribution. At 8 years old, she presented a drawing she'd made of her happy family. It showed Sarah, Greg, Ethan, and herself standing in front of a house, all smiling under a bright yellow sun. There was no fifth figure, no grandmother who had once been the center of her world. "This is my family," she said sweetly into the microphone. "We love each other and take care of each other. My teacher says families should make you feel safe and happy, and mine does." More applause, more validation for their narrative that I was the toxic element that had been successfully removed from their perfect family picture. As I sat in that homeless shelter watching my grandchildren publicly erase me from their lives, I felt something die inside me that I didn't think could ever be resurrected. The systematic indoctrination was complete. They didn't just believe I was bad for them, they were actively celebrating my absence. That night, I lay on my narrow cot, listening to the sounds of 30 other broken people trying to sleep, and I seriously considered giving up entirely. What was the point of fighting when the very people I was fighting for had been turned so completely against me? But then, just when the darkness seemed absolute, something unexpected happened. My phone, a basic model I'd bought with the last of my cash, rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me slide across to accept the call. Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Maria Santos. I used to be Maria Rodriguez when you trained me at CPS about 15 years ago. I heard about what's happening to you, and I want you to know that some of us remember who you really are. Her voice was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Maria had been one of my most promising trainees, a young woman who'd gone on to become a respected investigator specializing in parental alienation cases. Mrs. Chen, what's being done to you is textbook parental alienation, but turned against a grandparent. I've seen cases like this before, and I know the signs. I also know your work, your character, and your expertise. I'm not going to let them destroy you without a fight. For the first time in months, I felt something besides despair, a flicker of hope, small but fierce. Maria connected me with a network of retired child protection professionals who specialized in grandparent rights cases. They had seen patterns like Greg's before, and they knew how to fight back. As I hung up the phone that night, I felt something awakening inside me that I'd thought was dead forever. The investigator who had spent decades uncovering the truth in impossible cases was stirring back to life. They had underestimated me, underestimated the network of professionals who knew my real character. The real battle was about to begin, and this time I wouldn't be fighting alone. The call came from another former colleague, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had worked with me on several complex family court cases. Her voice was shaking with anger when she reached me at the shelter. "Louise, you need to know about this. Greg and Sarah are planning something big, something that's going to destroy your professional reputation permanently. There's a regional conference next month called Childhood Trauma and Healing, and Sarah is the keynote speaker." I felt my stomach drop. What kind of conference? It's being marketed as a breakthrough event for child psychology professionals. Sarah is presenting what she's calling a groundbreaking case study on recovering from intergenerational trauma and toxic family patterns. Louise, I think she's going to use your relationship as the case study. The full scope of their malice was becoming clear. It wasn't enough to isolate me from my family or destroy my personal life. They were going to use my professional expertise, my life's work as ammunition to build their own reputations, while simultaneously discrediting everything I'd ever accomplished. 2 weeks later, I sat in the public library using their computer to access the conference live stream. I had to know what they were saying about me, even though I suspected it would be devastating. Sarah took the stage, looking polished and professional in a navy blazer, her hair perfectly styled, her demeanor radiating the kind of confidence that comes from having an audience hanging on your every word. She had never looked more like the successful, accomplished woman I had always dreamed she would become. The irony was excruciating. "Good morning, colleagues," she began, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone who genuinely cared about child welfare. "I'm here today to share a deeply personal journey of healing that I believe has universal applications for our field." What followed was the most sophisticated character assassination I could have imagined. Sarah presented her childhood as a textbook case of emotional manipulation disguised as love. She spoke about enmeshed boundaries and parentification describing how a parent could use their professional expertise to manipulate and control their child while appearing to be devoted and caring. The perpetrator in this case was highly skilled in psychological manipulation, Sarah explained to the rapt audience. As a CPS investigator, she understood exactly how to present herself as the perfect parent while systematically undermining her child's sense of reality and autonomy. She never mentioned my name, but anyone who knew our family would recognize the story. She described my financial sacrifices as guilt-based manipulation and my emotional support as enmeshment designed to maintain control. Every loving memory I treasured was reframed as evidence of my psychological abuse. The most devastating part was how believable she sounded. Sarah had clearly done her research, peppering her presentation with legitimate psychological terms and established therapeutic concepts. She sounded like exactly what she claimed to be a survivor, courageously sharing her story to help other professionals recognize the signs of subtle familial abuse. Then Greg took the stage for his portion of the presentation. As Sarah's husband, I witnessed firsthand the long-term effects of this psychological manipulation. He said, his voice carrying just the right note of protective concern. When we started our family, Sarah struggled with anxiety and perfectionism that we eventually traced back to her childhood conditioning. Greg presented himself as the supportive partner who had helped Sarah recover her authentic self after years of being controlled by a manipulative parent. He spoke about the difficulty of setting boundaries with toxic family members and the courage it took to protect their children from repeating generational patterns of dysfunction. Sometimes, he said, looking directly into the camera, the most loving thing we can do is create distance from people who are unable to change their harmful behaviors, even when those people are family members who claim to love us. The audience was completely captivated. I watched the chat comments streaming by mental health professionals from across the country, praising Sarah's courage and Greg's insight. They were being hailed as breakthrough voices in the field of family trauma recovery. But the worst was yet to come. Midway through the presentation, they played a pre-recorded video message from Ethan. My grandson, looking earnest and slightly nervous, spoke directly to the camera about his improved emotional environment since his parents had made the difficult decision to limit contact with extended family members who were not healthy for our family. I feel safer now, he said in his young, innocent voice. My parents taught me that it's okay to say no to people who make you feel bad about yourself, even if those people say they love you. I'm learning to trust my feelings and set boundaries like Mom and Dad do. The implications were crystal clear. My own grandson was publicly testifying that he felt safer without me in his life, that my presence had been a source of fear and confusion for him. The child I had loved unconditionally, whose first word had been an attempt to say, "Grandma," was now poster boy for the benefits of cutting toxic grandparents out of children's lives. The conference reached its climax with the introduction of Dr. Alan Cross, who was presented as an expert in family psychology and childhood trauma. I recognized the name. He was the same Dr. Cross who had been involved in several questionable family court cases that my former colleagues had whispered about. Dr. Cross presented what he called medical evidence of the long-term effects of emotional manipulation on child development. Using generic case studies that could have applied to any number of situations, he painted a picture of how covert narcissistic parents could cause lasting psychological damage while maintaining a facade of loving devotion. The most dangerous abusers, Dr. Cross explained, are often those who are skilled at presenting themselves as victims. They manipulate family courts, exploit their professional credentials, and use their own supposed suffering to gain sympathy while continuing to harm their victims. The description fit me perfectly, and that was clearly the point. Without ever naming me directly, Dr. Cross was providing the professional medical justification for everything Greg and Sarah had done. He was giving their audience permission to view me not as a heartbroken grandmother, but as a dangerous manipulator who deserved to be isolated and discredited. As the conference drew to a close, Sarah delivered her final remarks with tears in her eyes. I want other survivors to know that healing is possible, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. It takes tremendous courage to break free from toxic family patterns, especially when the perpetrator is someone who raised you to believe that their love was unconditional. But children deserve to grow up free from manipulation and emotional abuse, even when it comes disguised as devotion. The standing ovation seemed to go on forever. I sat in that library chair, surrounded by the quiet hum of computers and the whispered conversations of other patrons, watching hundreds of child welfare professionals applaud my daughter for her courage in escaping my abuse. Later that evening, still reeling from what I had witnessed, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Patricia Holmes, the colleague who had first warned me about the rumors circulating in professional circles. Louise, I attended that conference today, and I need you to know that not everyone was fooled by what we saw. That presentation was masterfully crafted, but there were inconsistencies that a few of us noticed. She went on to explain that several attendees had approached her afterward with concerns about the case study. Some details didn't align with established patterns of emotional abuse, and the medical evidence Dr. Cross presented seemed suspiciously generic. I'm preparing an affidavit documenting your professional competence and ethical standards, she told me. Dr. Williams from the Family Court Psychology Department has agreed to co-sign it. We've worked with you for years, Louise. We know who you really are. For the first time since watching that devastating conference, I felt a spark of hope. Greg and Sarah might have won over hundreds of professionals with their polished presentation, but they hadn't fooled everyone. There were still people in my field who knew the difference between genuine expertise and sophisticated manipulation. As I prepared for sleep that night in the crowded shelter dormitory, I held onto that small flame of validation. They had used my own professional knowledge against me, twisted my life's work into a weapon for their own advancement. But the same expertise that made me a target also made me dangerous to them, because I understood exactly what they were doing, and I knew how to fight back. The war for my reputation was far from over. The lawsuit arrived on a gray October morning, delivered by a process server who found me at the shelter during breakfast. The papers were thick, official, and devastating in their scope. Greg was suing me for $350,000 in damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation of character, and harassment leading to psychological harm. I read the complaint with the cold horror of someone watching their own execution. According to Greg's legal team, my attempts to contact my family constituted a campaign of stalking and intimidation. My gifts to help with their mortgage were reframed as manipulative financial coercion designed to maintain inappropriate control. Even my heartfelt letters expressing love for my grandchildren were characterized as psychologically abusive communications intended to undermine parental authority. But the lawsuit was just the opening salvo in Greg's financial warfare. Within days of filing the civil suit, he contacted my former employers at the Department of Child and Family Services with concerns about my mental competence and professional conduct. The call from DCFS came 3 days later. Helen Martinez, a supervisor I'd worked with for years, sounded deeply uncomfortable as she explained the situation. "Louise, we've received reports suggesting that your recent behavior indicates possible cognitive decline or psychological instability. There are allegations that you may have engaged in conduct that reflects poorly on the department's reputation. We're required to investigate any claims of professional misconduct, even from former employees." "Helen, you know me," I pleaded. "You know my record, my character. This is retaliation from my family. They're trying to destroy me financially and professionally. I want to believe that Louise." But the allegations are detailed and specific. They include claims that you've been stalking family members, making false accusations, and exhibiting signs of paranoid delusions. We have to take this seriously. The investigation moved with bureaucratic efficiency. Within 2 weeks, I received notification that my pension benefits were being suspended, pending a full review of my professional conduct. The committee cited credible allegations of gross misconduct related to the misuse of professional expertise for personal manipulation as grounds for potential permanent termination of benefits. Just like that, my sole source of income vanished. The pension I had earned through 35 years of dedicated service, the foundation of my financial security in retirement, was stripped away based on the malicious lies of my own family. The cascade of financial ruin accelerated rapidly. Without my pension, I couldn't afford the legal representation needed to fight Greg's lawsuit. My court-appointed attorney, overwhelmed with cases and clearly skeptical of my claims about family manipulation, urged me to consider settling out of court. "Mrs. Chen, I understand your position, but the evidence against you is compelling. Your family has documentation of numerous attempts to contact them after being asked to stop. They have witnesses who will testify about your erratic behavior. Maybe it would be better to negotiate a settlement and move on with your life." Even my own lawyer didn't believe me. The narrative Greg and Sarah had constructed was so convincing, so professionally presented, that it was easier for everyone to assume I was the problem, rather than consider the possibility that I was the victim of an elaborate scheme. The eviction from my modest apartment came next. I had managed to find a small place after losing my house, but without my pension, I couldn't make the rent. The landlord, Mrs. Patterson, had been understanding at first, but after 3 months of missed payments, her patience ran out. "I'm sorry, Louise, but I have bills to pay too. I've heard about your troubles, and I think it might be best for everyone if you found somewhere else to live." The timing of my eviction wasn't coincidental. Brenda had made sure that several local media outlets knew about the disgraced former CPS worker who was being removed from her apartment for non-payment of rent. A photographer was waiting outside as I loaded my remaining possessions into garbage bags, capturing images that would later appear online with captions about fallen professionals and the consequences of toxic behavior. The humiliation was designed to be public and complete. Here was Louise Chen, who had once commanded respect in professional circles, reduced to a homeless woman carrying her life in plastic bags. The visual was perfect for their narrative. I looked exactly like what they claimed. I was a mentally unstable elder who had lost everything because of her own destructive choices. But Greg wasn't finished with his psychological warfare. As I struggled with the reality of being homeless and financially ruined, he made a purchase that was clearly designed to twist the knife deeper, using money from investments he claimed to have made with funds I had given him money that was supposed to help with their mortgage, but had somehow become his personal business capital. Greg bought a brand new Mercedes AMG, a luxury vehicle worth more than most people make in a year. The purchase was announced on social media with a post that made my blood boil. Sarah shared photos of the gleaming black car with a caption that read, "So grateful for my husband's hard work and business success. This beautiful gift represents all the dreams we're building together as a family. Thank you, Greg, for showing our children what dedication and vision can accomplish." The comments below were filled with congratulations and admiration. Friends and neighbors praised Greg's success and Sarah's gratitude. No one mentioned that the business success he was celebrating had been built on money stolen from his wife's impoverished mother. Seeing those photos, knowing that my financial generosity had been transformed into a symbol of their triumph, while I slept in a homeless shelter, broke something fundamental inside me. The car wasn't just a luxury purchase, it was a trophy, a public monument to their successful destruction of my life. My physical health began deteriorating rapidly under the relentless stress. The combination of financial terror, emotional devastation, and the physical challenges of homelessness pushed my body beyond its limits. I developed chest pains that kept me awake at night, severe headaches that made it difficult to think clearly, and a persistent exhaustion that no amount of rest could relieve. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning in November. I was standing in line at the soup kitchen trying to ignore the stares of other patrons who recognized me from the news coverage when the chest pain that had been building for days suddenly exploded into agony. I collapsed right there in the serving line, my body finally surrendering to the unbearable pressure of everything I had endured. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of someone calling for an ambulance and the terrifying realization that I might die surrounded by strangers, completely alone. I woke up 3 days later in the cardiac intensive care unit, connected to machines that beeped and hummed around me like electronic prayers. The doctor, a kind woman about Sarah's age, explained that I had suffered a massive heart attack brought on by extreme stress and exhaustion. "Mrs. Chen, you came very close to dying. Your body has been under tremendous strain, and frankly, I'm amazed you survived this long under such conditions. Do you have family we can contact?" I almost laughed at the irony. Family. The very people who had engineered my destruction were probably the beneficiaries on my life insurance policy. But as I lay in that hospital bed, tethered to life by medical technology and the kindness of strangers, something unexpected happened. In the haze of medication and recovery, my mind began processing memories differently, connecting dots I hadn't been able to see clearly before. I remembered a case from 15 years earlier, a father who had systematically turned his children against their mother using techniques so sophisticated that even experienced social workers had been fooled. I recalled the meticulous way he had documented every interaction, building a legal case while simultaneously destroying his wife's credibility. The similarities to my own situation were chilling and unmistakable. Greg hadn't just been cruel or vindictive. He had been following a playbook using professional-level psychological manipulation techniques that I recognized from my own casework. I wasn't just a victim of family betrayal. I was the target of a calculated campaign of abuse designed and executed by someone who understood exactly how to use the system against me. As that realization crystallized, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The fog of self-doubt and despair began to lift, replaced by the sharp focus I remembered from my most challenging cases. I might be broken and nearly dead, but I was still Louise Chen. I still had the investigative skills that had made me successful for 3 decades. And now I knew exactly what I was fighting against. Recovery was slow and painful, but the clarity I had gained in those critical moments sustained me through the worst of it. With the help of a compassionate nurse named Jennifer, who reminded me painfully of Sarah. At that age, I began planning what might be my final attempt to reach my daughter with the truth. The idea came to me during one of those long, sleepless nights when pain medication couldn't quiet the ache in my chest. I would create a video message, not the angry, desperate pleading I had attempted before, but a calm, systematic presentation of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or misinterpret. Working with Jennifer during her night shifts, I recorded everything on her personal phone. First, I played the audio recordings I had kept from Sarah's original phone call, asking for money, her voice clearly promising repayment, her casual tone suggesting this was a routine business transaction, not an emotional manipulation. Then I played the second recording, where she had boasted to Brenda about how easy it was to convince Mom to give us the money. But the most damaging evidence was something I had almost forgotten about a conversation Sarah and I had years earlier during a particularly difficult period in her marriage. She had called me late one night, crying and frightened, describing Greg's controlling behavior and his explosive anger when things didn't go his way. "Mom, I'm scared," her voice said on the recording, young and vulnerable in the darkness of my hospital room. "He gets so angry when I disagree with him about anything. He says I'm stupid, that I don't understand how the real world works. Sometimes I feel like I'm losing my mind, like I can't trust my own thoughts anymore." I had recorded that conversation not to use against her, but because as a CPS investigator, I had learned to document concerning situations involving the people I loved. I wanted to be able to help her if things escalated. Now playing back that heartbreaking conversation, I could hear the early signs of the psychological manipulation that would eventually be turned against me. Greg had been conditioning Sarah to doubt her own perceptions, to rely on his interpretation of reality, the same techniques he would later use to convince her that her loving childhood had been a facade, hiding my abuse. In my video message, I methodically laid out the timeline of Greg's manipulation, connecting Sarah's gradual change in behavior to specific incidents I could document. I showed how he had isolated her from friends who questioned his treatment of her, how he had gradually taken control of their finances, and how he had systematically rewritten their family history to cast me as the villain in every story. "Sarah," I said directly to the camera, "I know you believe you're protecting your children from me, but I need you to remember who you were before Greg convinced you to doubt your own memories. Listen to your own voice on these recordings. Remember the frightened young woman who called me for help. That woman knew the truth about who was really hurting her." The message was 18 minutes long, too long for social media, too complex for sound bites, but comprehensive enough to present a complete picture of the manipulation we had both endured. I asked Jennifer to send it directly to Sarah's personal email, the account I knew she checked herself, rather than having Greg screen her messages. But we underestimated the extent of Greg's surveillance. 2 days later, I discovered that Greg had been monitoring not just Sarah's communications, but also the hospital's network. Through bribed staff members and his connections in the medical community, he had intercepted my video before Sarah ever saw it. What happened next was the most sophisticated and devastating betrayal yet. Greg took my raw, honest video and turned it into a weapon against me. Using digital editing software and his network of professional contacts, he manipulated the footage to create something entirely different. He altered the audio quality to make my voice sound unstable and paranoid. He spliced together segments to make it appear that I was rambling incoherently. He added ominous background music and dark lighting effects that made me look deranged and threatening. Most crucially, he edited out all the evidence, the recordings of Sarah's contradictory statements, the documentation of his controlling behavior, the logical progression of my argument. What remained was what appeared to be the desperate delusional ramblings of a mentally ill woman trying to manipulate her family from her hospital bed. This doctored video was then sold to a national gossip news program for what I later learned was a substantial sum. Greg presented it as evidence of my complete psychological breakdown and proof that the family had been right to protect themselves from my unstable and potentially dangerous behavior. The story aired on a Thursday evening during prime time, reaching millions of viewers across the country. The program presented it as a cautionary tale about elderly relatives who become so consumed with family grudges that they lose touch with reality. Sarah appeared on the same program the following night, giving what was perhaps the most devastating performance of her life. Dressed in a soft blue sweater that made her look vulnerable and maternal, she sat across from the sympathetic host with tears glistening in her eyes. She spoke about the heartbreak of watching her mother's mental deterioration and the impossible choice she had been forced to make between protecting her children and enabling her mother's delusions. "It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do," she said, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine anguish. "But as a mother, my first responsibility is to my children. I can't expose them to this level of instability and manipulation, even from someone I love." The host nodded sympathetically, praising Sarah's courage in speaking out about such a personal situation. When asked about the specific allegations in my video, Sarah shook her head sadly. Those recordings she claims to have, if they even exist, are from conversations taken completely out of context, probably from years ago, when I was going through a difficult time in my marriage. My mother has always had a need to be the center of attention, to be seen as the savior in every situation. Now that we've established healthy boundaries, she's creating elaborate fantasies to justify her behavior. But the most heartbreaking moment came when they brought Ethan on camera. My 11-year-old grandson, looking solemn and far too mature for his age, spoke directly to the host about his concern for his grandmother's health. "I wish Grandma could get better," he said with devastating sincerity. "Mom says she's sick in her mind, and that's why she says things that aren't true. I hope the doctors can help her, but we have to stay safe while she's sick." The program ended with information about resources for families dealing with toxic elderly relatives and mental health services for seniors. Sarah and Greg were presented as brave parents doing their best to protect their children while still hoping for my recovery. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for Sarah's courage and condemnation of my behavior. The hashtag #ProtectOurChildren began trending with thousands of posts from people sharing their own stories of toxic family members they had been forced to cut out of their lives. Comments ranged from sympathetic to vicious. That poor woman having to deal with a narcissistic mother while protecting her children. Elderly abuse is real. These old people think they can manipulate their families with guilt trips. Thank God those children have parents who will protect them from that crazy woman. But it was Jennifer, my compassionate nurse, who provided the lifeline I needed to survive this latest assault. Late that night, after the program had aired and the internet had exploded with judgment about my mental illness, Jennifer came to my room with tears in her eyes and a manila folder in her hands. "Mrs. Chen, I've been documenting everything that's happened during your stay here. Every conversation, every visitor interaction, every phone call. What I witnessed doesn't match what they showed on that program. She opened the folder to reveal meticulous notes about Greg and Sarah's hospital visits I hadn't even known about because they occurred while I was sedated. Jennifer had recorded Greg's explicit instructions to the medical staff about providing me with minimal care, his suggestions that I was manipulative and likely to fake symptoms for attention, and his specific request to be notified immediately if I tried to contact Sarah. Most damning of all, Jennifer had documented a conversation between Greg and Brenda in the hospital corridor, where they had discussed making sure this ends permanently and ensuring that I would never be able to cause problems for the family again. Mrs. Chen, Jennifer, said quietly, I've been a nurse for 12 years, and I've seen real elder abuse, real mental illness, and real family dysfunction. What's happening to you isn't illness. It's systematic psychological torture, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. As she handed me copies of her documentation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, hope backed by concrete evidence. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had an objective witness, someone with professional credibility, who had seen the truth behind their carefully constructed lies. The real fight was about to begin, and this time I had proof. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A legal settlement from a case I had worked on 20 years earlier had finally been processed through the courts. The check arrived at the hospital like a miracle, nearly $200,000 from a class action lawsuit against a corrupt adoption agency I had helped expose. Money I had forgotten about arriving at the exact moment I needed it most. With Jennifer's documentation and this sudden financial lifeline, I was able to assemble the legal team I needed to fight back. Maria Santos connected me with Judge Patricia Williams, recently retired, but still fierce in her pursuit of justice for vulnerable populations. Judge Williams brought in David Chen, a civil rights attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases, and Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic IT specialist who could analyze digital evidence. Within 6 months, we had filed a comprehensive federal lawsuit against Greg, Sarah, Brenda, Dr. Cross, and the lawyers who had enabled their conspiracy. The charges included elder abuse, financial fraud, defamation, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the psychological manipulation of minors of federal crime when it involves deliberate alienation strategies. The case attracted national attention immediately. Former CPS investigator fights back against family's alleged elder abuse conspiracy became headline news across major networks. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had spent her career protecting vulnerable people was now fighting to protect herself from the very family she had devoted her life to loving. But the real drama would unfold in the courtroom. The trial began on a crisp Monday morning in federal court, with cameras rolling and the nation watching. I sat at the plaintiff's table between Judge Williams and David Chen, feeling stronger than I had in years. Across the aisle, Greg and Sarah sat with their expensive defense team, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew what was coming. Dr. Martinez took the stand first, and her testimony was devastating. Using sophisticated forensic analysis, she had completely deconstructed the video Greg had created from my original hospital recording. On large screens, visible to the packed courtroom, she showed exactly how the audio had been manipulated, how segments had been spliced together, and how visual effects had been added to make me appear unstable. This level of digital manipulation, Dr. Martinez testified, requires significant technical skill and premeditation. This wasn't a simple edit or misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, sophisticated effort to create false evidence for public consumption. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. James Morrison, the forensic psychologist we had brought in to analyze the patterns of manipulation. Dr. Morrison had spent months studying Greg's behavior, reviewing the timeline of events, and analyzing the psychological techniques that had been used against both Sarah and me. What we see here, Dr. Morrison explained to the wrapped courtroom, is a textbook case of what we call systematic psychological manipulation or coercive control. Mr. Martinez didn't simply dislike his mother-in-law. He methodically implemented a long-term strategy designed to isolate her from her support systems, undermine her credibility, and ultimately destroy her financially and emotionally. Dr. Morrison walked the jury through Greg's tactics, step by step, how he had gradually isolated Sarah from friends who might question his narrative, how he had reframed every act of love as evidence of control, how he had used professional psychological terminology to give his manipulation a veneer of legitimacy. Most crucially, Dr. Morrison continued, Mr. Martinez exploited Mrs. Martinez's childhood trauma and suppressed memories to convince her that her mother had been abusive. He took a woman's loving protection of her daughter and twisted it into evidence of psychological manipulation. Then Dr. Morrison presented my CPS case notes from Sarah's childhood documents I had meticulously maintained throughout her youth, showing a devoted mother helping a traumatized child heal from her father's abandonment. The notes revealed my careful ethical approach to helping Sarah process her pain without destroying her sense of security. These documents show no evidence of manipulation or abuse, Dr. Morrison stated firmly. They show a professional who understood child psychology, applying that knowledge to help her own daughter heal. Mrs. Chen's approaches were not only appropriate, they were exemplary. When Sarah was called to testify, the transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. The poised, confident woman who had appeared on television just months earlier was gone. In her place sat someone who looked fragile and haunted her hands, shaking as she was sworn in. David Chen approached her gently but relentlessly. Mrs. Martinez, have you reviewed the evidence presented by Dr. Martinez showing that the video of your mother was deliberately manipulated? Sarah's voice was barely audible. Yes. And Dr. Morrison's analysis of your husband's systematic manipulation tactics? Yes. Tears began flowing down her cheeks. Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to play an audio recording now, one of the original recordings your mother made of your phone conversations. This is unedited, unmanipulated. I want you to listen to your own voice. The courtroom fell silent as my daughter's voice filled the air, young, vulnerable, frightened, describing Greg's controlling behavior and begging me for help. Then came the second recording, where she boasted to Brenda about how easy it had been to get money from me. As Sarah listened to her own words, something inside her shattered completely. The careful facade she had maintained for years collapsed all at once. She began sobbing uncontrollably, her whole body shaking with the force of her breakdown. He made me believe it was all true, she cried out, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. He convinced me that my memories were wrong, that Mom had hurt me, that everything good I remembered was fake. He said I was protecting my children, but I was destroying the person who loved me most. The judge called for a recess, but Sarah couldn't stop. Years of suppressed guilt and manipulated memories were pouring out of her all at once. Mom, I'm so sorry, she wailed, looking directly at me for the first time in over 2 years. I'm so sorry I let him turn me against you. I participated in destroying you. I'm so sorry. I felt my own tears flowing as I watched my daughter's pain. Even through everything she had done to me, seeing her suffer like this was agonizing. This wasn't triumph, this was tragedy. My vindication was coming at the cost of my daughter's complete psychological collapse. But the courtroom drama wasn't over. Greg, watching his carefully constructed conspiracy fall apart, attempted to flee during the recess. He was apprehended in the parking garage by federal marshals, his dignified facade finally cracking as he was led back to the courtroom in handcuffs. "This is all lies," he screamed as cameras captured his meltdown. "She's manipulating all of you, just like she manipulated Sarah. Can't you see what she's doing?" But perhaps the most devastating moment came when Mark took the stand as a witness. My son, who had stood by silently while his family destroyed me, was forced to confront the full scope of what had happened. When David Chen asked him directly whether he had ever witnessed me abuse or manipulate Sarah, Mark's composure crumbled. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No, never. Mom was the most loving person I knew. She sacrificed everything for us, and I watched them destroy her and did nothing." Mark began weeping openly, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his guilt. "I was a coward," he sobbed. "I chose the easy path instead of defending the woman who raised me. I will never forgive myself for what I allowed to happen to her." The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of my son's anguished crying. Even the judge looked moved by the profound remorse and shame emanating from the witness stand. As the day ended and court was adjourned, I sat in the plaintiff's chair, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and heartbreak. The truth was finally being revealed, justice was being served, but the cost had been devastating for everyone involved. My family wasn't just broken, they were completely shattered. But for the first time in over 3 years, I felt something I had almost forgotten: hope. The truth was more powerful than their lies, and justice was finally within reach. The verdict came after 6 hours of deliberation, and it was as comprehensive as my legal team had hoped. Judge Harrison's voice rang clear and firm as she delivered the court's findings. In the matter of Chen versus Martinez et al., this court finds the defendants guilty of criminal elder abuse, financial fraud conspiracy to commit fraud defamation, and the psychological manipulation of minors for the purpose of parental alienation. The sentences were severe and unforgiving. Greg received 10 years in federal prison plus full financial restitution of over $400,000, covering not just the money he had stolen, but damages for emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages designed to send a message. Sarah received 7 years reduced slightly due to her clear victimization by Greg's manipulation, but the court was unambiguous about her culpability. Mrs. Martinez was indeed manipulated by her husband, Judge Harrison stated, but she was also an active and willing participant in a campaign of psychological torture against her own mother. Her professional education and adult status do not excuse her choices to repeatedly harm a vulnerable elder. Dr. Cross lost his medical license permanently and faced criminal charges for his false testimony. The lawyers who had enabled the conspiracy were referred to the Bar Association for disciplinary action. Brenda was sentenced to 3 years and ordered to pay additional damages for her role in the defamation campaign. But beyond the criminal penalties, the court issued something even more important to me, a formal judicial finding that completely vindicated my character and reputation. Judge Harrison's words were read into the public record and later published in legal journals across the country. Louise Chen's 40-year career as a child protection specialist was exemplary in every respect. Her approaches to child welfare, family psychology, and trauma recovery were not only appropriate, but innovative for their time. The court finds no evidence whatsoever of the alleged emotional abuse or manipulation. To the contrary, the evidence shows a devoted mother and grandmother whose love was weaponized against her by individuals seeking financial gain and psychological control. The judge continued, "This case serves as a stark reminder that elder abuse can take many forms, including sophisticated psychological manipulation that exploits family bonds and professional reputations." The court hopes this verdict will encourage other victims to seek justice and will deter potential perpetrators from targeting vulnerable elders. The restoration of my professional reputation was perhaps the sweetest part of the victory. Within days of the verdict, I received calls from former colleagues, professional organizations, and academic institutions offering apologies for how quickly they had distanced themselves from me. The State Child Welfare Alumni Association reinstated me with a formal apology and asked me to speak at their next national conference about elder abuse prevention. But the personal reckonings were more complex and painful than the legal ones. Sarah's letter arrived while she was awaiting transfer to federal prison. It was 12 pages long, handwritten on legal pad paper and soaked with her tears. I could barely read parts of it where the ink had run. "Mom," it began, "I know there are no words that can undo what I've done to you. I know that sorry isn't enough when I participated in torturing the person who loved me most in the world, but I need you to know that I remember now. I remember everything." She went on to describe how Greg had gradually convinced her that her happy childhood memories were false, how he had used her therapy sessions to implant suggestions about suppressed trauma, how he had isolated her from anyone who might contradict his narrative about my supposed abuse. "He started small," she wrote, "just questioning little things about my childhood, suggesting that my loyalty to you was unhealthy. He convinced me that you had parentified me, that your devotion was actually a form of emotional incest. He used real psychological terms, real therapeutic concepts, and twisted them to make your love sound sick." The most heartbreaking part was her description of how she had gradually convinced herself that her loving memories were fake. "I wanted to believe I was protecting my children. It was easier to rewrite our history than to admit that the man I married was systematically destroying my family. I chose the lie because the truth meant I had to face what I was allowing to happen." Sarah's letter ended with a promise: "I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did to you. I will use my story to help other families recognize these patterns. I will make sure Ethan and Chloe know the truth about who you really are and what I really did. I cannot undo my choices, but I will spend every day trying to honor the love you gave me, even when I didn't deserve it." Mark's journey toward redemption was slower, but equally profound. He enrolled in intensive therapy immediately after the trial, specifically seeking treatment for what his therapist diagnosed as moral injury, the psychological trauma that comes from participating in or witnessing acts that violate one's core values. His letters to me arrived monthly, each one documenting his progress in understanding his own complicity and cowardice. I kept telling myself I was staying neutral. He wrote in one particularly raw letter, "But neutrality in the face of injustice is just cowardice with a prettier name. I watched my mother being destroyed and chose my comfort over her dignity." Mark's therapy involved not just personal healing, but education about elder abuse, parental alienation, and family manipulation. He volunteered at senior centers, worked with elder abuse prevention organizations, and eventually began speaking at conferences about family complicity in elder abuse. "I want people to understand," he told me during one of our carefully supervised phone calls, "that it's not enough to not participate in abuse. If you see it happening and do nothing, you become part of the problem. I enabled Greg's abuse by refusing to take a stand, but perhaps the most complex and delicate healing involved my grandchildren. Ethan and Chloe had been deeply traumatized by their parents' downfall and the public revelation that their entire understanding of their family had been built on lies. The court ordered family therapy for them, and their therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, worked carefully to help them process what they had experienced. It was Dr. Kim who first contacted me about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship. "They're confused and frightened," she explained during our initial phone call. "They've learned that everything they were taught about you was false, but they're also grappling with the fact that their parents, people they trusted, deliberately lied to them and used them as weapons." The first meeting was arranged at Dr. Kim's office with careful preparation on both sides. When I saw Ethan and Chloe for the first time in over 3 years, they looked older, more serious, marked by trauma, but also curious. Ethan, now 14, spoke first. "Grandma, we learned about what really happened, about what Dad did to you and what Mom did. We learned that we said things to hurt you that weren't true." Chloe, now 11, was crying quietly. "I drew that picture without you in it," she whispered. "I drew our family without you because they told me you were bad for us. But you weren't bad. You were the best grandma, and we helped them hurt you." The healing would take years, but in that moment, I felt something I had thought was lost forever: the possibility of rebuilding authentic relationships with my grandchildren based on truth rather than manipulation. As for Greg, his fate was exactly what he deserved. Abandoned by Sarah, who filed for divorce the day after the verdict, he served his sentence isolated and despised by other inmates who had learned the details of his crimes. The man who had orchestrated such elaborate psychological warfare found himself completely alone, his cunning reduced to nothing, his manipulation tactics useless in an environment where his sophisticated lies meant nothing. The restoration of my reputation and relationships was profound, but it was only the beginning of a larger transformation. I realized that my experience, as devastating as it had been, could serve a purpose beyond my own vindication. With the financial settlement from the lawsuit, I was able to establish the Louise Chen Foundation for Elder Justice, an organization dedicated to preventing financial and emotional elder abuse. I began speaking at conferences, training law enforcement officers to recognize sophisticated manipulation tactics and working with other survivors to help them find their voices. My story became a beacon for other elderly people who had been isolated, manipulated, or abused by family members. I received hundreds of letters from people who saw their own experiences reflected in mine, who found the courage to seek help because they knew they weren't alone. The woman who had once been branded as a delusional, manipulative elder had become a national advocate for elder rights and dignity. My pain had been transformed into purpose, my suffering into strength for others. 5 years after the trial, I wake each morning in my restored home, not the house I lost during the darkest days of Greg's campaign, but a new place that belongs entirely to me, free from the painful memories of betrayal. The morning sun streams through windows I chose into rooms I decorated with furniture that reflects my own taste rather than what others expected of me. The financial settlement and the success of my advocacy work have given me something I never expected to have again: complete independence. I am beholden to no one, dependent on no one, and free to make choices based on my own values and desires. After decades of putting my family's needs before my own, this autonomy feels like a precious gift. My days are full, but peaceful. 3 mornings a week, I work at the foundation offices, reviewing cases of elder abuse and developing new training programs for social workers and law enforcement. The work is challenging and meaningful, allowing me to use my professional skills to protect other vulnerable seniors from the kind of systematic abuse I endured. Tuesday afternoons are reserved for my support group, 12 other elder abuse survivors who meet at my home for tea and conversation. We call ourselves the Phoenix Circle because we've all risen from the ashes of our destruction. These women have become my chosen family, united by shared experience and mutual understanding that no biological relation could match. The healing with my own family has been gradual but genuine. Sarah was released from prison after serving 4 years, her sentence reduced for good behavior, and her exceptional work with other inmates who were victims of domestic abuse. She emerged from incarceration a different person, humbled, self-aware, and committed to making amends for her participation in my torment. Our relationship now is nothing like it was before the nightmare began, but it's something new and perhaps more honest. Sarah lives across the country now, working as a counselor for women who have escaped abusive relationships. She sends me letters every week, not the desperate, guilt-ridden apologies of her early days in prison, but thoughtful reflections on her healing journey and updates about her work. I understand now, she wrote in her most recent letter, that what Greg did to me doesn't excuse what I did to you. I was both victim and perpetrator, and I have to own both parts of that truth. But I also understand that love isn't possessive or controlling. Real love gives people the freedom to be themselves, even when that's inconvenient for us. Last month, Sarah came to visit for the first time since the trial. We spent 3 days together talking honestly about what had happened and what we had both learned. She attended one of my speaking engagements, sitting in the audience, as I told our story to a room full of social workers and elder care professionals. Afterward, she approached me with tears in her eyes. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said. "I'm proud of how you survived what we did to you, and I'm proud of how you've used that survival to help other people. You turned our cruelty into something beautiful." Mark's journey has been different but equally profound. He never remarried after his divorce, choosing instead to focus on his work as an advocate for elder rights and his role as a father to his teenage children. His therapy helped him understand that his passivity during my abuse was a form of participation, and he's dedicated himself to making sure he never again chooses comfort over justice. He visits monthly now, bringing his children, my other grandchildren, to spend time with me. These relationships are new and still careful, but they're built on honesty rather than obligation. Mark's children know the full story of what happened, and they've chosen to build a relationship with me based on who I am now, not on family duty. Grandma Louise taught me that standing up for what's right is more important than keeping peace. Mark's daughter told her school counselor when asked to write about a family hero. She showed me that even when everyone turns against you, you can still fight for the truth. But perhaps the most healing relationships are with Ethan and Chloe. Now 17 and 14 respectively, they are thoughtful, compassionate young people who have done remarkable work to understand and process their childhood trauma. They spend summers with me, not because a court ordered it or because their parents require it, but because they choose to. Ethan is particularly interested in my advocacy work. He's read all my speeches attended several of my presentations, and even helped me develop educational materials for teenagers about recognizing manipulation and abuse in families. I want other kids to spot the signs we missed, he told me. I want them to know that adults can lie, even adults who are supposed to protect you. Chloe has found her own way to process what happened. She's become an artist, and many of her pieces explore themes of truth, memory, and healing. One of her paintings hangs in my living room, a beautiful complex piece showing a family tree where some branches are broken, but new growth is emerging from the wounds. This is us, she explained when she gave it to me. We're not the same family we were before, and we can't pretend the broken parts didn't happen, but we can grow something new from what's left. My work has expanded beyond individual advocacy to systemic change. The Louise Chen Foundation has successfully lobbied for stronger elder abuse prevention laws in 12 states. We've trained over 10,000 social workers, police officers, and healthcare workers to recognize the signs of sophisticated psychological manipulation. Our educational materials are used in universities across the country. But perhaps most importantly, I've written a book about my experience. The Invisible Wounds, A Family's War Against Truth, became a bestseller and has been translated into 8 languages. The book provides both my personal story and practical guidance for recognizing and escaping psychological manipulation within families. I received letters from readers around the world, elderly people who recognized their own experiences in my story, adult children who realized they had been manipulated into abusing their parents, and professionals who learned to look beyond surface presentations to identify sophisticated abuse. Your book saved my relationship with my mother, wrote one reader. I realized that my wife had been systematically convincing me that my mother was manipulative and toxic. After reading your story, I recognized the tactics and was able to rebuild our relationship before it was too late. These letters remind me daily that my suffering served a purpose beyond my own healing. Every person who escapes manipulation because of my story, every elder who gets justice because of our advocacy, every family that avoids destruction because they recognize the warning signs, all of this gives meaning to the years of pain I endured. As I sit in my garden this evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I reflect on the journey that brought me to this place of peace. The woman who was once homeless and hopeless, branded as mentally ill and dangerous, has become a voice for justice and a beacon of hope for others. I think about forgiveness, not the kind that excuses or forgets, but the kind that releases the burden of hatred and allows healing to flourish. I have forgiven Sarah and Mark, not because they deserved it, but because carrying anger was poisoning my own peace. I have forgiven myself for the choices I made that inadvertently enabled my abuse, understanding that love sometimes makes us vulnerable to manipulation. Greg, still serving his sentence, represents the only relationship I have not been able to heal. Perhaps some wounds are too deep, some betrayals too calculated to allow for redemption. But even this unhealed relationship has taught me something valuable, that forgiveness is not always possible or necessary for healing to occur. My life now is rich with purpose, authentic relationships, and the deep satisfaction that comes from transforming pain into power. I am no longer defined by what was done to me, but by what I chose to do with what was done to me. Tomorrow, I will wake up in my own home, make my own choices, and continue the work of protecting others from the kind of systematic cruelty I survived. This is not the life I planned, but it is a life I have chosen built on the foundation of truth, resilience, and an unshakable commitment to justice. I am Louise Chen, survivor advocate, and proof that even the most devastating betrayal cannot destroy a spirit committed to truth and healing. Years have passed since that dark chapter of my life ended, and as I sit in my garden watching my granddaughter Chloe help me tend the roses we planted together, I am struck by how completely my life has been transformed. The woman who once slept in a homeless shelter, branded as mentally ill and dangerous by her own family, now lives in dignity and purpose, surrounded by relationships built on truth rather than manipulation. My home is a sanctuary of peace and authenticity. The walls are covered not with photographs of a false perfect family, but with pictures that tell the real story, images of my work with abuse survivors, awards from organizations that recognize my advocacy, letters from people whose lives have been changed by my story. These are the artifacts of a life reclaimed and redeemed. The relationships I have now are fewer than they once were, but they are infinitely more precious because they are based on choice rather than obligation, honesty rather than manipulation. Sarah visits twice a year, and our conversations are deep and real in ways they never were before the truth was revealed. Mark calls weekly, sharing his own journey of healing and his work to prevent other families from experiencing what ours did. Ethan and Chloe choose to spend time with me, not because they have to, but because they want to understand their history and learn from my resilience. My work continues to expand and evolve. The foundation has helped thousands of elder abuse survivors find their voices and seek justice. My book continues to reach new audiences, and I regularly speak at conferences around the world about the sophisticated nature of psychological manipulation within families. Each person who finds the courage to seek help because of my story validates the choice I made to transform my pain into purpose. But perhaps the most profound lesson I've learned is about the nature of strength itself. I once believed that strength meant enduring suffering, silently accepting betrayal gracefully, and putting family loyalty above personal truth. Now I understand that real strength lies in the courage to speak truth, even when it costs everything to seek justice, even when it seems impossible, and to rebuild a life based on authentic values rather than other people's expectations. The scars remain, and they always will. There are still nights when I wake from dreams about those dark days, still moments when the memory of my grandchildren's coached cruelty brings tears to my eyes. But these scars have become a source of wisdom rather than shame, reminders of what I survived and overcame rather than symbols of what was done to me. For anyone who reads this story and sees their own experience reflected in mine, I want you to know that healing is possible, justice is achievable, and a life of dignity and purpose can be built even from the rubble of the most devastating betrayal. The voices that tell you that you are crazy, manipulative, or toxic are lying. Trust your own experience, seek allies who believe in truth over convenience, and never surrender your right to be treated with basic human dignity. Family is not defined by blood or legal relationships, but by love, respect, and mutual support. Sometimes the family we choose proves more loyal than the family we are born into. Sometimes the greatest act of love is setting boundaries that protect our own well-being. Sometimes justice delayed is not justice denied, but justice arriving exactly when we have the strength to receive it. My story ends not with bitter triumph over my enemies, but with quiet satisfaction in a life well lived, a purpose clearly defined, and relationships that honor the truth rather than hide from it. I am Louise Chen, and I am free. The truth, as I learned through the darkest chapter of my life, does not guarantee an easy path, but it does guarantee a meaningful one. And in the end, meaning matters more than comfort, authenticity, more than approval and justice, more than false peace. This is the legacy I leave, that love without respect is manipulation, that silence in the face of abuse is complicity, and that it is never too late to choose truth over convenience, courage over comfort, and dignity over false harmony. These are the lessons written in scars, earned through suffering, and offered freely to anyone brave enough to claim their own life and their own truth.